represents about $250 million of expenditures. As you know, next week we'll go through the individual activities and programs, which will outline our services that we're going to provide to our citizens. But today we're going to devote to kind of the big picture, the 20,000 foot level of slicing and dicing the big picture items for you on the budget itself. Talking about property taxes, utility rates, and what's reflected in here. And again, next week we'll get in much more detail. And then the all important final Tuesday, the wrap-up session where you'll want to make, if you want to make any additions or deletions to the recommendation, will be motions being made at that time. We'll ask you to approve the capital improvements plan, and you'll make decisions on some of the outside funding to CODA, asset, and those outside funding sources. So as we move along, we appreciate your input and keep it in a workshop setting if you could, so you can ask questions. All the questions you ask, I think, will probably be important to the citizens too, and it's important we want to make sure they understand the budget. There's a lot of money being spent here, we think for very good purposes, but we want them to understand where it goes and why we're expending it. So if you don't mind, we'll go through some of the same format we showed before. I think Dwayne and Nancy do a great job of presenting an in-depth look at our budget. We'll start with some overheads on that if we could, and interrupt us as we go.
Right, you have a couple documents in front of you. One's the big budget book, and then also there's this packet called special reports. And I'll kind of walk through that. I have slides on some of the information, and some of the information I actually condensed down a little bit in the slide because there's a lot on some of those. First of all, our theme for this year's budget is the Ames Municipal Airport, and there's our nice new terminal with a sign out front. Again, we always like to remind people that when we're talking about the property taxes for the city, that's only about a third of your bill, and these are the rates for the current year. And this is for Ames City, Ames School District. If you're in the Gilbert School District, we're a little bit smaller portion of that bill, but as always, we run about a third of the total tax levy. The next page in the packet gives the details on that. If you're interested, that just breaks out every single bit of those levies. Next page, on page 3 in the packet, we talk about where Ames stands as far as against other cities. And this is something we discussed in November also with budget issues. In the current year, we're at about 1007. Of course, that year we're now halfway through or more than halfway through. That put us at the second lowest rate of the smaller cities in Iowa. And also per capita, we fare pretty favorably. So we'll go right on to some of the bigger picture items in this year's budget. Our property tax rate will be down 4 cents from FY 18-19 of the current year. We have increased taxable and assessed value in every class of property, and we'll go over that in a little bit of detail. Revaluation this year was minimal and will have very little impact on taxes paid. That was a pretty big issue last year. We'll again have a balanced general fund budget for operations and capital, so we'll bring in the same amount of money we spend. We're forecasting a 3% growth in local option sales tax revenue. That's been an area of concern over the last few years. For this current year, we had forecasted, and we believe we're going to hit zero growth, but there's been some changes with the way we collect and remit internet sales, and we think that's going to lead to some growth next year. We'll have a utility rate increase for water and also our resource recovery tipping fee. There's some other scheduled increases that we'll hit in the packet pretty briefly. So on page 4, you have a very detailed analysis of where we are with the levy rates. Up in the slide, that breaks that down to a little bit more of a summary. But we're up 5.7 in the value. We're up about 5.3% in the total asking. So that results in the increase in the value is higher than the increase in the tax asking, so that means the rate goes down a little bit. So we'll go from about 1007 to 1003, about 4 cents down. Another area I think we'd like to point out here is plus I want to use the new pointer.
Yeah, he's trained on this. Look how good it is.
TIF valuation. That's a valuation that's subject to our debt service levy, but not the rest of our levy. So that's up significantly. That value was about 34.5 million last year. So the impact of that increase in TIF means the value subject to debt service is actually up 6%. So that helps us out with that debt service levy. We'll point out a couple levies here. The general levy at $5.52. That's the levy that's subject to the 810 limit. And you'll see most cities are at that level. That levy was up 2 cents this year. The employee benefits levy was down a little bit. Transit levy actually almost flat, and debt service levy down a little bit. Now, of course, with the general levy being our largest levy, those negatives kind of balance out, and we're down 4 cents overall.
Dwayne, a question?
Yes.
For the TIF valuation, I think you said is about a $9 million increase over last year?
Yes. Well, actually a little more than that. It was up about 11 million.
About 11 million, okay.
Right.
So that's just spread across, it's 1 year capture of all of the TIF projects we have going on? Is that how to think of it?
That's correct.
Okay.
Right. So
Right.
you think about those are new areas under development, so they hopefully go in big chunks up
Okay.
and
Thanks.
then get closed out fairly quickly. Next slide, we just look at kind of the history of our levy in the last few years. And we were at 1063 back in 15-16. We were pretty flat for a couple years in 16-17 and 17-18. And again, very little change this year, down a little bit. I don't have a slide in the packet, but one area to look at is our local option sales tax impact on our tax levy. So as you probably know, 60% of that local option sales tax, that one penny, goes directly to reduce our property tax rate. So if you look at that far right column in the graphic, you can see that reduces our rate by $1.59. That's the reason it's a less of an impact. If you look at last year, it reduced the rate $1.63 is because our valuation, our expenses are up faster than a local option sales tax. We're predicting that to go up 3%, but the other things are up a little over 5%. But if you look back a year, if you can look at the difference here when we went from 17-18 to 18-19 and had no growth in local option sales tax, that there was a dramatic difference in how that impacted our tax rate. So this is a pretty good recovery compared to the prior year, and we hope that continues. Valuation change pretty strong this year at 5.7%. What's really important is how that's broken down, and we have that on the very next slide. And as I mentioned, and I'd like to point out here, we think it's good news when every single class of property shows a positive signs over there in that right-hand column, and that means we were up both in assessed value, in taxable value, in every class of property here in the city of Ames. And then a nice modest increase, about 6% for the year. This next slide just provides a graphic of a little bit of the history of where we've been as far as property valuation. But I think the good news here is we've had a nice trend of increased valuation every year. Pretty flat if you go back, in the years we were just coming out of the recession. But since then, it's been a steady, I think, sustainable growth. Now we're on to page 9, and again, we talked about, where did these changes in valuation come from? Most of it is a new valuation. So a total new value, that up 5.7%, is a little bit lower here because I take out utilities subject to excise. But we're up 164.5 million. We're up 132 just in new growth. So that's new property that didn't pay taxes last year. And we also have an adjustment with the rollback. So those two items, that rollback means that the rollback rate applied to residential property is a little bit higher this year. So those two items account for the vast majority of our change in rates this year. One area that I'd really like to point out is this new are increased valuations. That was a big issue last year, and it wasn't evenly spread across the classes. That number last year was about $160 million. So, contrast that to 2 million, it's a dramatic difference. Now, part of that in the prior year, we had rollback that went the other direction, so it got mitigated, thankfully, somewhat on those property owners. But those issues that we had last year don't really exist this year. So that's, I think, a good news situation for our taxpayers. There should be no kind of big surprises or big changes on tax bills for the upcoming year. Next slide. I don't have a slide on it because it's pretty long and involved, but it's one area that we use fund balance to help even out our tax rates.
Page 10.
Yeah, page 10 in your packet, and that's, if we can flip back and look at the slides here. So in our levy breakdown, in the employee benefits levy, the only thing that we levy in that area is for our police and fire retirement system contributions. And I guess it's been 28 years ago, that system shifted from a locally operated system to one that was combined with the states. And at the time, we took an actuarial value of everyone's system, and if you were short, you had to pay in a little bit more. If you had extra money, you could retain that and use that to help pay the city's contribution. Now, we could have used that in large chunks right away and really reduced the tax rate, but we have stretched that out over 28 years and used that as a method to even out the ups and downs in that contribution rate. And that means this year that we don't expect to, we're planning not to use any of that fund balance. We still have some available, but we're looking ahead. We have a forecast of what the contribution rates will be in the next few years, and then we'll use some of that balance. You can see when you get out to the 22, 23, we expect to use the last of that amount of money. That'll have been 31 years. The good news is there's been some changes to that system where we're amortizing some of the unfunded liability, and we can fully expect the contribution rates to steadily and slowly go down after 22, 23, and that's the same time that we'll have used up this balance. So I think we can expect fairly consistent tax rates and fairly consistent contributions into that system going forward. And we'll use the rest of this fund to balance that out.
So Dwayne, do you expect that the estimated tax rate in FY 23-24 to stay about the 69 cents
do.
then?
What is happening, we closed I don't want to get into a long actuarial, well, I wouldn't mind, but I think you don't want to have a long actuarial discussion. But we used to re-amortize the unfunded liability every year. And there were some changes made in the system where we closed that. So if you think about it, your house, if you re-amortize your house every year, you would never start paying principal. And it was the same thing with the liability against this unfunded liability against the system. So we closed that. We would be increasing contributions a little bit to help pay that down. And at some point, you kind of get over the hump, just like on paying for your house, and you're contributing more and more towards the principal. And that happens with pay down of the unfunded liability of this system in 23, 24. So obviously, we're going to have different changes in earnings rates and things like that. But as far as that pretty significant portion to pay off that unfunded liability, that's going to go down every year after that. Next slide, another area where we'll use some fund balance, but right now we'll just talk about what makes up the levy. Our debt service levy is at $3.19, and that's made up, of course, of the debt that we're going to issue this year and all the debt that we've issued in the past years that is still outstanding. So on page 11, we break out by each of the major areas of where we have debt issued and how much of that outstanding debt goes to those other items. Then down at the bottom, the CIP that we covered mid-month, that includes some new items that are funded by GO bonds. Those are included also. And this is also an area where we use some fund balance. And same situation, we look forward and we try to even out that tax rate. So we have some fund balance available. We could use that all right now. And you could lower the fund balance, but we've got a CIP that has differing rates. Let me go back here. We have different amounts of CIPs out the next 5 years. Right now, it's 10.5, then 11, 11.8. We have differing reductions in the amounts of our balances that we pay down in the future years. But this column right here, we're using different fund balances each year. Right now, we're planning on 0 this year, 325 next year, then 60, 225, 190. And we keep with a pretty even, like right around 319, 320 tax rate for each of those 5 years. We've been doing this for years. It's been pretty successful. We had forecasted to stay about even for this year, but you see we're down a little bit at 319. And that's because we use a 3% annual growth rate. Of course, we did better than that this year. So that's another area where there's balance to use, but the city manager is recommending that we use none this year.
So the art to this is we tried to keep this level rate. You see that? So that allow you to do, if we're going to add a fire station, we're going to add a healthy life center, you'll have to add on to it. Now you're going to ask me, is there a time when something drops off? Well, that reflects, that level rate already reflects us filling in with other projects that are in the CIP, all the street projects we do and other projects. So we've leveled it now. Anything we place will be on top of that, okay? Allows you to do that. And some cities have policies where they have a policy, they're only going to have so much in debt service. They're going to freeze the debt service, like 11 million a year. Some people have, a rate has to stay the same, okay? You don't have anything. Like, we look at the projects we need, but we are cognizant of the impact it has on taxes, so we try to keep it as flat as we can. Sometimes it has to go up if we have some big projects on top of our street systems. So I think we've positioned in a pretty good spot right now for that.
So the state replacement tax is actually the backfill, is that correct?
That's correct.
So if that goes away, how do we accommodate that then?
Well, again, I've built into, we'll go over, I've built into the general fund, which is
I mean-
supported by taxes, about we'll go over the exact number, $700,000, which we use for a number of things. And some of it would be to replace backfill. Even if the backfill goes away, I hope it doesn't, but if it does, based on what we heard last year from the legislature, it would be phased in over time. We will be able to layer in, we'll have about 2/3 of it already budgeted for that. And portion of it will go to debt service, portion of it would have to go to the general levy, portion of it would go to the transit levy. So we've positioned ourselves, not with 100% of it, but about 2/3 of it, I think.
So either we have to,
80% of it, 80% of it.
so either we have to increase the bond issuance, which would actually increase our debt service levy, or reduce in order to make up that difference, right? Because you're actually using that to help.
Nope. We would move money in from the general fund available balance into the debt service fund to help. So it creates a bigger fund, which we then can apply to this.
I see.
So we're positioning ourselves for unknowns. Now, last year we had 100%. I'll emphasize before. Now we have about 80% of it.
I have a question. You said that it sounds like you try to keep the debt service levy kind of flat. And I understand why the taxpayer wants the overall sum of all of the levies to be flat, but why is it important to keep this particular one flat rather than just making sure the sum of them is flat?
The sum of them are
The
flat?
sum of all the levies that a taxpayer has to pay.
No. Well, this one will have the greatest impact if we layer, Tim always challenges us, and we're going to have some big capital improvements on there. So I'm trying to keep it flat so you can add on at some time to it. I know what you're saying. This probably has the biggest what is it?
This one would be the most variable since the other
Yeah.
ones are
What is-
almost entirely operating.
Yeah, go
I
back.
see. Okay,
Go
so
back to the other levies.
Go back to the
So this is
total
what-
levy. I'll show you.
it
Yeah.
just has a bigger impact.
Has a
So-
bigger
so it's more
impact. Look,
important to keep it flat. Okay.
So yeah, that,
The general levy will gradually grow with operations, but when you throw in a healthy life
Yeah.
center, it's a big jolt, or a fire station, that's a big jolt in there. So it's tough to keep them all. If I had to do that, that would be detrimental to us because it would cause me to have to reduce the general levy, which is operations, to try to offset that big jolt and would be devastating to our operations. I can't do that. I can't make them, I can't cut back one to mitigate the other
Yeah, I
one.
see. Thanks.
so the combination of these levies generates a total of a little over $31 million in tax dollars, and it was up about 1.5 million from the prior year. And it's important to kind of understand where do those come from by class of property. And we have this broken out, and I think the important thing to look at here is, here's how much each of the different classes of property pays in total levy. So there's $31 million, and of that, 20.2 is paid by residential, 9 something by commercial multi-residential, and we're up that 5.3%. Last year, because of those different changes in value, residential increase essentially paid almost all of the increase in property taxes. That was up about 7%. Commercial multi-residential was up just slightly. Industrial was actually down. I think utilities were pretty flat last year. So this year, it's pretty evenly spread across the different classes of property as far as the increase in the tax dollars. So we think that's pretty good news to the taxpayers. I'm sure maybe if you were the class that was going down, you might have liked that. But I think steady is a better situation for just about everybody. So again, back to that number you've seen before, we're adding about $1.5 million in tax dollars. And, there's a good question, where does that come from? 1.368 million, or a substantial majority of that, comes from new construction. So properties that did not pay taxes last year, they're paying this year, will pick up the lion's share of that increase. We have some changes on to the rollback. We actually, rolled up for the residential, so that has an impact on them of increasing their taxes, but that's partly offset by that rate decrease. So there is an increase on the existing residential owners due almost entirely to the change in the rollback. We still have a little bit of changes in value on property, not much this year. So total change on the existing property, of course, they're up and down. There's an increase on residential, a decrease on commercial, multi-residential. Their rollback didn't change, but they get an advantage of that lower tax rate. So in entirety, on all the classes of property, they're paying about an additional $200,000.
Now, this is a pretty impressive figure here. In an ideal world, and it's not possible to have an ideal world, you would hope that the additional taxes that you ask for could come out of growth, all new growth. People have never paid taxes before, and they would be paying for it. We're pretty close to that under this budget, and that's hard to do. Only $196,000 out of that $1.5 million is coming from all of us who have existing properties.
Next slide, we just take a look at taxable valuation by type of property, and we've continued a trend of the residential property, and this year partly due to the rollback, but also there's been some good valuation growth there, being a larger portion of our taxable valuation. Now, it's not, a big significant change. If you go back to 16, 17, that class of property was 63.4% of the value. Now it's up to 65.74. And that's coming through commercial and industrial being a slightly smaller portion. And those going from, 30 to 29. So not a big shift, but we continue to see that move a little bit. So where's that all come together to impact the taxpayer? So we've got 5+% increase in our In our expenses, a little bit higher increase in that in valuation. That results in a slight reduction in the tax rate of about 4%. But for residential property owners, we have an increase in the rollback from 55.6% to 56.9%. So if you take a look at the impact of this budget and the new tax rate at $100,000 in valuation, that would mean the residential would go up $10.62 or less than 2% at 1.9. Commercial, whose rollback is frozen, they would actually get the benefit of that reduction in rate. They'd be down $3.87 or essentially flat, down 0.43%, and same thing with industrial. Now, every year we know that people's valuation could change, and that $100,000 house might be a little more than 100,000, a little less than 100,000. But every property is different. But what we do is we look at the entire group as a class and see how it changed through the year. This year, kind of good news, there was not a big change. So that 100,000, if you take the average revaluation, that would be up to 100.1. So a very slight increase. So they would go up from 1062 to 1132. From just under 2% to just over 2%. Revaluation on commercial was down slightly, so that impacts them from being down $3.87 to being down $4.84. So still right at around 0.5%. Industrial, very little change, very few properties. They'll get advantage of that reduced rate. On the next page in the packet, we're up to page 18. I don't have a slide on this, and this is an area where you'll see detail across the budgets next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. But we take a look at what are some of the major items that impact that increase in the tax asking of about $1.5 million. So we have some changes in revenue with transit, the fire contract with Iowa State, and then all other revenues up about $221. So the non-tax revenues were up slightly, about $384,000. Changes in expenses were up a little over $1 million. And then and a lot of that was due to salaries. This is a very operations-driven budget when you get into property taxes. And we have a couple new FTEs, our new employees, one in police, one in fire, that are funded by property taxes. And you'll hear more about that next week. Another area, obviously you've probably seen the news, and we've certainly looked at it and touted it when we do our bond rating. Ames has an extremely low unemployment rate. In fact, when I looked last September when we were doing our bond rating, we were the lowest in the nation. So that's good news from one aspect, but also put some pressure on the job market. And we have a couple areas that use a significant amount of part-time employees that we need to attract, provide quality services, and those are primarily in the library and parks and recs. So we're in the process of increasing those salaries so we can continue to attract those part-time employees that deliver those services. So that's a fairly significant increase also, but one that's certainly needed to continue to deliver services. So those all add up to an increase of about $1.3 million. And then we need a little bit additional amounts in the other levies, including debt service, and that's how we come up with that $1.5 million. Again, next week, we'll see a lot more information on that. Next page in the book, again, we don't have a slide on this one. There's a lot of information going on here. But Nancy, when we get done with this portion, we'll cover the fund sheets in the back of your budget book. But we do have some additional balance, and Steve had talked about that in the general fund. And I won't go through all this, but this just provides you with some details of the bigger areas of where that came from. Now, we do intend to use part of that fund balance on some one-time projects. And had we not used these in 18-19, that would mean that taxes would need to be increased by another approximately $500,000, assuming you wanted to do these projects. The biggest one, about half of the $500,000, is additional funds needed for the Homewood Clubhouse. The rest of them are spread across the different departments. There's a fair amount in police, some upgrades to the cemetery. The Human Service Agency capital grants is also in here at 50,000. But those are in what would be the adjusted budget for 18-19, current year. And those are excess general fund balance that we showed you in the previous slide. And those are included in the budget, and we'll spend down part of that general fund balance. But as Steve mentioned, we're still maintaining a significant balance that will hold, just as a contingency in case we lose some, I think it would be some of that replacement tax.
Where's,
Wayne? Sorry.
I think the budget for the radios went up $750,000, which is definitely an important project. Where's that coming from? Where's that additional cost?
The cost is out of the debt service. You'll see that page that shows where that debt service money comes from. You'll see radio system in there.
Yeah,
So we increased that. We already issued $1 million. I think we put another $1.2 million in.
We did.
What page is that?
That's included if you flip back to page 11. You'll see that higher amount. Down at the bottom, we break out what was in the 1920 CIP, and that it's going to be different than your CIP because when we made that document, we were just in the process of reviewing these radios. So we know it's up. So we've included it in this budget, and it'll be in your final CIP also.
Now, there's ongoing operating costs for the radio and also paying for the maintenance of the new tower system. We actually, of course, we're hoping, and this is the calculation they gave us, that the amount we have budgeted now for existing radios, which were to take care of replacement costs, the towers, and the radio operation themselves, will be the same as it now. So we've actually kept it the same amount that's in the current level in each one of the operating departments because they pay for their radios.
So we've already put $1 million, so to speak, away, right?
Pardon me?
We already put $1 million for the radios, $1 million last year. is that
Last
right?
year.
We issued $1 million.
And then this year we're doing 1.24.
We're actually doing a little bit more than that. If you look down to the bottom, we have some what we call abated debt, and that's debt paid by sources other than the property taxes. So the radios that are used, for example, for our utilities, they'll still be paid for. We'll still issue debt, but we will not collect property taxes to pay for those.
To give you an example, that would be for like the water radios, okay? So we'll borrow the money through general obligation bonds, but rather than use taxpayers' money to pay back, there'll be an operating expense each year from the water fund to pay back these bond funds. No taxes. The utilities pay for their own radios through there.
Again, I'm not questioning, nor do I think that we
Nope.
shouldn't do it. Just curious where the different money came from, because I know we had to raise it quite a bit because the radios came in a lot more expensive than
yeah.
anticipated.
That's
And
all included.
so at the end of this year, we'll have everything funded, or you'll have to have a little more funding next
Well,
year to
I
make
don't
it
want to
up.
say ever because they're still negotiating that final agreement. This is the best information. It changed from last year.
Yeah.
And I had to report to you was a lot more. This is we added to it now, and I hope it's not any worse than this, but I can't guarantee you.
Right.
We have a consulting firm that's negotiating with 2 different companies to do this process. So I hope we're conservative, but I can't guarantee it.
Gloria, did you have a question too?
Yeah, we increased the expenditure for the Homewood Clubhouse to, what is it, a $1.2 million project or something
It's
now?
about 1,050,000, I think, or 1.1 million, I think.
Assuming that we're going to get revenue from the rental of that property, where does that revenue show up in the future in this budget?
Well, we're recommending that it show up as revenue to the Homewood Golf Course. We're not projecting anything for next year. I'm not sure if it's done at the end of the year or what. I think we're going to play through the season. We haven't even planned for the schedule of the construction yet. So I don't think there's any revenue showing up for the Homewood yet. We're not recognizing any revenue.
We're on to page 21 in your packet, and this is a graphical presentation of that same page. But this is something that I think is a little bit unique to the way we prepare our budget. But if you remember back to the slide where we talked about the sample taxes, the $100,000 home residential would pay $571 in taxes for this coming year, 1920. And we break down each of the areas of where does that money go to. So largest portion is streets and traffic, and that's almost 100% debt service. So that's the debt service out of your property taxes going to streets and traffic. The largest group collectively is protective services, so police and fire at 135 and 85. Library, and we also include the debt that's associated with these activities. So the library at $70 includes the debt service portion that goes to pay for the big improvements to the library. Parks and Recreation, also some debt in there. We're still paying off the Furman Aquatic Center and I think a little bit left on the Ada Hayden Heritage Park. Transit, that's the city's tax contribution to the transit system. We start getting into smaller pieces here, general support services, planning, stormwater. We do have a stormwater utility that pays for all the operations of that utility, but we do from time to time for larger high demand projects issue some debt for stormwater projects. So that reflects just the debt service that pays for stormwater projects. Resource recovery, again, a utility that pays for most of their operating, but each of the member communities provides a subsidy to that system, and this reflects the city's contribution. And then we go down to animal control, facilities and cemetery. We'll talk about cemetery a little bit with fees here going forward, but that's a fairly small portion of the total tax dollars.
Wayne, on that slide,
Yes.
one small addition I think would be very helpful is to designate that the total, if you go back to the slide,
Yeah.
the total of that is the $571. If you just look at the slide on its face, you'd have to go through manually and add all those up to get the
Yeah.
571. Might be helpful to note in that somewhere in the bottom
Right
that
on the bottom.
the total of taxes for the 100,000 is that 571.
So you think people don't enjoy adding up numbers as much as I do? Is that-
I was trying to be helpful.
Okay.
Some of us do not.
Yeah. okay.
It's a really helpful,
Yeah.
it's a very powerful slide for
Yeah,
illustration.
it's on the other
Yeah,
page
it's
on
one we use
21.
for a
it
lot
has
of
it,
things.
But we should put on
Yeah,
this
we
page.
can-
We have it on
Add
21.
it down to the bottom. Yeah.
We have it added, but we could still do it on here. It's a good suggestion.
Yeah, I agree.
And we have to keep reminding everybody that when you get your property tax bill, your bill will probably be a little less than $1,800. Because remember, the 571 represents a third of your property tax bill. You do pay taxes to the county, Story County. You do pay taxes to the school district and a little bit to DMAC and some other areas.
We're going to shift gears a little bit here. I'm not going to spend too much time on the next few pages, but we have some historical information on FTEs, property tax rates, valuation increase going back several years on page 23. We've got changes in full-time equivalents on page 24. And again, as each of these departments, divisions present their budget, they'll talk about changes in FTEs. I'll flip over to page 25. And this gives a breakdown of the change in the manager's recommended budget for 1920. Now, a couple of these I talked about briefly because they're funded primarily with property taxes, the first being a police officer. And this is the addition of a second school resource officer. So a portion of that will be paid by the Ames public school system. We have the addition of a firefighter. We've been slowly increasing the firefighter positions in anticipation of an eventual addition of another fire station. We're able to fund that with a decrease in the tax rate this year, which I think is good news. Some changes in the SIRIDE rules, and I think Sherry will talk about that, require the addition of a chief safety officer. So that's reflected in our portion of the funding of the SIRIDE system. So that we only have a portion of that expense, but that's in our levy. And then also we've added a utility maintenance position. I believe it's a senior heavy equipment operator, but I guess the big message on that is to have additional position to help maintain and keep those underground utilities up and working well.
I think in the current year too, the adjusted, we're asking
Oh, I'm
for,
sorry, yeah.
is it 0.50 of the 0.75? I think the utility customer service one was approved before. I think the other two are new additions. We're asking for not to wait until July 1st, but to immediately make the adjustment. That's why those will be new. And they're already included in the totals you see.
Steve, I have a question on the FTEs. And if we ask a question that's better for next week, then there's nothing magical about it. I can make a note to bring up later. This is the first I remember a discussion of adding an FTE for a second school resource officer.
Yes.
And if you were to have told me we were going to add someone, I would have guessed that would have been increasing the mental health advocate role. So is the driver of this coming from the schools or our police or both?
The chief will explain to it. I think it's from both. I think the chief here feels very strongly that it is warranted, but it has the full support of the schools. We've been in discussions with them. So I think both would concur this is a priority for them.
And the fee is split 50-50?
No, in my letter, you'll see how it's split. Here's how we're going to do it. We're going to have two of them. We're going to split the cost of that officer for 9 months, 9 months school districts in, and then the city will pick up 100% of the officer's time for the 3 months during the summer when school's out. So it comes out maybe 60-40. I don't know the exact number, how much we end up paying. Maybe a little
Tim,
higher.
to your question too is, I think I just saw on the news a few days ago that I think the Iowa State just picked up a mental health professional
They did,
on their police force,
yeah.
which possibly could help alleviate some of the strain that Julie Saxton goes through. But I'm with you that if there's more need for mental health support, even on our own force, it'd be a good question to ask Chief Sykosh where we're at on that. But I mean, I think it's nice that, is that a full-time?
I have no idea.
I know that Julie was on TV and she was really excited that they actually have someone coming on to the ISU police force,
Yeah, I think that is a full-time position with ISU. I remember seeing
which
that.
hopefully will help because you got half the residents are students. Anyway,
I mean, it'd be helpful if when Chief Sykosh presents his budget to explain what the drivers are for that, the needs that they're seeing that justify adding an FTE in that role. I mean, it's a different kind of position than we have for any of the other police. We're designating them in our schools, and it'd just be helpful to have a little explanation of that.
Steve, one of the things that always strikes me when we look at these FTEs is that we're looking at them from an internal perspective. What do we need? Do you have any sense of how we compare to other communities in our use of full-time employees versus part-time employees to accomplish what needs to be accomplished?
It varies between each operation, you know what I'm saying? I know we try to do a better job than most people. I always don't like to tag myself on what other people are doing because we try to beat that. And police is a good example. They have some standards of so many officers per 1,000, half of our population at the university. So you have to remember there's a police department there too with ours. So you get caught up in the numbers really versus what are you trying to accomplish service wise? And then we have to decide how many people we need to do that, or perhaps we contract out as a more cost effective way, or we partner with somebody else. So sometimes we do things differently. We use outside people to help plow snow. Farmers who come in, very cost-effective way. You might look at how many full-time people they have plowing snow in other cities. They may have more. I'm not sure it's more cost-effective than we do it. So you have to be careful by looking at numbers. I think you need to know, are we providing the service level you want? And if you're not, then you challenge us to come up with the most cost-effective way to meet that service. Think of personnel as an input to a service. You as policymakers determine the output, and then we are charged with finding the best way to provide that output, the level of service you want. And we look at those numbers, but I don't hang my hat on it saying we've got to increase ourselves by 20 people because another city's doing it. If that was the case, I'd be raising property taxes because we're the lowest. if we look around and what property tax are, I could really get up to the top really quickly, but I don't necessarily want to do that. So
I think that's one of the questions that I get. I don't know whether anybody else gets, but why don't we hire one more police officer or one more firefighter?
Well, we are.
And
we have been.
no, but I think that the perception of the community is that the way to address things is to hire more people. And so I wanted to clarify that isn't really what we are attempting to do. We're trying to cover the service level that's necessary.
That's right.
And that it's not always about hiring another full-time
Right.
employee to accomplish.
Although for police and fire, I'm trying to do what you've always told me to do with fees too. You'd rather see it gradually increase than wait and hire 15 people at one time. So I'm gradually putting them in there. But you'll see those are, each one of those positions with roll-up is $100,000. So you add 3 or 4 positions, it's expensive.
And one more question, Steve, on the firefighter. So this overtime thing's a big deal. So is it possible that the savings in overtime is going to take a substantial bite out of the cost of the savings, and overtime would help to defray the cost of the additional firefighter? You have a sense of that?
I know you're saying, can we cut it? I think we've cut as much as we can. We've acknowledged that, and we've cut it. A lot has to do with, it's not only overtime. A more seasoned force has more vacation time. Older force has more sick leave time. And unlike when some of us are gone, we don't have to fill in behind. But when police and fire are gone, we have to bring people in. That's where the overtime is. So it's not just related to overtime, related to a number of people. It could add, any people could still lead to overtime is what I'm saying.
Okay, thanks.
But we watch that and try to mitigate it. We have certain policies that are collectively bargained too that affect overtime by how liberal we are allowing people off for vacation. And that leads to overtime. So there's a lot of things, not just number of people is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Okay, ready to move on?
Talk a little bit about some rate and fee increases that are included in this budget. As far as utilities, the only rate increase will be for water, and that's in at a 7% increase. And, I want to make sure we point out that you will not be asked to improve utility rates with the budget, but need to know that we have a 7% increase built into the budget. Also, this is not one that we bill directly, but for resource recovery plant, the tipping fee or the tonnage fee charged to haulers, we have included going from $55 to $58.75. And we also have a second increase for 22-23 forecasted for that utility up $58.75 to $62.50. And then the CIP that you saw mid-month, I guess it was last month, no, it's the first, but included a lot of capital improvement plans for the water and the sewer. And these are the rate increases that are needed to support both the changes in the operating and the capital going forward for both of those utilities. We also had some debt, SRF debt in sewer, and these rate increases would cover the repayment of those bonds. But as you can see, they're split across different years, so we're not stacking these rate increases. No rate increase expected with the current operations or capital for electric, and none for storm sewer for the full term of the CIP. And of course, that could change. So we want to look at what's the impact of that increase on the average. And John Dunn will cover a lot more when he has a rate workshop when we talk about the actual ordinance change for increasing the rates. But with water, that increase of 7%. This is on the median use residential customer, and that's 600 kilowatt hours of electricity, 600 cubic feet of water. And we do it on the summer rates, which are higher, or would show the bigger impact. So that would be up $1.73, or up 1.28% on their total utility bill with that 7% water increase. I would also like to point out here, kind of interesting right now, our energy cost adjustment for electric is actually a negative or a credit to the bill of $3.66. So we have a certain amount built into the rate for energy. And if that energy costs a little bit more, there's an adjustment to pick that up. If that energy costs less, there's a credit against the bill. And right now we're running a credit. Now, commercial, residential, a pretty steady group. If you use 600 cubic feet of water, 600 kilowatt hours of electricity, that, there's not big variances. For our commercial customers, it really depends on the type of business. So we have come up with what we would say is a median commercial use, and this is a large power, so this would be one that's a large user of electricity. And also a fairly large user of water, 1,500 cubic feet. That's a lot of water. That 7% increase on water would increase their bill $33.74 per month. But they're, any of these type of customers are very electric heavy as far as their bill goes. So their impact would only be 1/2 of 1%. That's all we have for slides here. Included within the packet, we have other fees and rate increases. So we have some fee increases for adoption of animals at the animal shelter. And I think part of this change was, I believe they took out the refund for neutering. Is that correct? And then it's included in the bill. There was a lot of kind of headaches to, okay, we'll charge you a certain amount, then we'll give you some back when the pet is neutered. I think now they just do the neutering and charge you a higher fee. So there's some police department fee charges, pretty minor. Parks and Rec. I'm sorry, here's the public works fees. And that includes the per capita charge that was changed last year, the increase of $58.75 in the tonnage. And then by ordinance, the Parks and Recreation Commission sets the fees for those activities, and those are included here. And that includes both the Park and Rec classes and the fees at the city auditorium. And again, Keith will be available to talk more about those. We have some letters attached. One from Mayor Hala, from Dan Colhane at the Ames Economic Development Commission. I think you've probably, they're all to you, so I think you've probably seen these. Ames Human Relations Commission, another letter about that. Letter from the Ames Foundation. I don't know if you want to talk any more about those letters, Steve, or you want to jump into the fund sheets? Or?
I don't know, anybody have questions on those? You'll get your recommendations next week on, or end of next week, I think. We'll have it for the Human Service Agencies, CODA, outside funding. I think we're prepared to handle that.
I think we hand them out
On the
Thursday night
12th.
as part of their decision packets.
Yeah, Thursday night, at the end of our hearings, Thursday night, for the next Tuesday decision. I think we'd like to go over the big picture on the funds, if we could, with you. Take a few minutes. And Nancy? you
Yep,
run through?
I'm ready. So if you turn to the fund summary section, which begins on 255, we have a summary of all of the different city funds in the back, and you've all seen all of these before, so I'll go over them pretty quickly, not go into a lot of detail, but if you have questions as I go through, be sure to jump in and just ask. So on page 257 is general fund, which we always spend a lot of time talking about. So you've seen quite a bit about it already, but kind of the main thing to notice when you get to page 259 is that, and at the bottom, it is balanced for this year. Again, the revenues equal the expenses, and we are reserving the 25% of revenues less the pass-throughs. That's the hotel motel tax money and the transit levy. And we still have an unreserved balance of $884,919, which is what Steve was referring to, that we have a large portion still available to fund anything additional or for if we would lose part of the backfill funding.
So that will take care of the backfill, but there could be other issues you've talked about in the past couple of months, but you have not approved yet. Because that money's there for any action the council may have for those, okay?
Can I follow up on that? There's no need for us to really discuss that from the budget perspective right now. We should have a substantial discussion about those topics later, and then this money is there in case.
I've kept that money there for you. It doesn't have to be allocated even by the end of next Tuesday or Tuesday after, because it'll be there in the balance to pull from at any time
Throughout the year.
throughout the year.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, one thing I want to point out is a transfer from the electric utility. This is for the citizens and you all again. We try to treat our electric utility, many are private sector utilities and they pay taxes. So we try to treat our electric utility as if it was a private sector. We don't want our citizens to be hurt by this particular arrangement. So we actually have the electric utility make a payment in lieu of taxes. And again, if you look at other cities, I have to tell you, sometimes they use that electric utility to help lower property taxes. So they have no rhyme or reason on what they transfer out of that balance into the general fund. We're more disciplined than that. We actually have a formula. We treat ourselves as if we look at our book value, if you will, by our auditor, of all the value of the electric utility and its lines and improvements has a value to it. We then apply the tax rate, the previous tax rate to it, which comes up with a dollar amount. So even if I wanted to say, hey, I could really look good here, I can take another $3 million out and we can lower taxes. We don't do that. We stay very disciplined. And it's interesting, you notice sometimes it goes down because when your rate goes down, actually the amount that's moved over here, I don't try to say, oh, they paid us $2,200,000, so next year we're gonna have the same amount. I stick to that formula. Very disciplined, very fair, I think. We wear the hats, you all wear the hats as running the electric utility too, so we want to be careful we don't overreach. But it's funny, if you ask how other cities are doing, and I could tell you, I could show you, they pull a lot of money out of electric utility to help lower the property taxes, and we don't do it that way. Any questions on the general fund? You know where we're at? We're in good position to do some things you might want, 25%.
So we adopted last year the budget of 30,
We're
on page 259.
yes,
Is that right? So it says adopted was that 32 million, 32.3, right? Before transfers?
Yes, total operations.
And then our adjusted is 34, almost 6. So it's $2.3 million more we spent than what we had adopted. Is that right? Am I saying that right? Or
Where
Yeah,
are we
that-
looking at?
That's, if you look over in the adjusted column under CIP, those are almost all of that.
Oh,
change
gotcha.
in There was those projects that weren't done.
oh, so we didn't
carry forward. We don't just overspend that. Usually we carry the project, the funding comes with it over.
Yeah, you would have had additional balances because we had not spent those
Right.
and they just get carried ahead.
And then also the things that we talked about earlier that we add out of the general fund balance would only show in the adjusted year too. They wouldn't
sorry,
have been
I can't hear
adopted.
you. Sorry.
The items that we talked about earlier, like the additional funding for the Homewood Clubhouse, that would show in the adjusted budget, but it wouldn't have been adopted last year
But we have the available balance to take care of
to
it.
cover it, yes.
And then we added the comprehensive plan update fee for the 225,000. Is that right? That was not budgeted last year.
That's carried forward.
Mhm.
Where do you see that? Is it?
258 comprehensive plan update.
Let me see. Where it is.
Yeah, that's carry forward funding.
Yeah.
You'd actually budget that a couple years ago and we carried
Yeah.
it forward.
Okay. Also, so in an adopted excludes anything which is carried forward from previous years then, is that correct?
The adopted,
Right.
We adopted $0 for the comprehensive plan
Right.
update,
Right.
but we had budgeted 225 the
From the
previous year.
yes.
So that's not actually slid underneath and adopted. It's
No,
just,
it's not included in it could, because it would have been in the 17-18 adjusted budget.
right.
So it wasn't adopted in 18-19,
okay, I see.
but then wasn't spent.
Good questions.
So that'd be the same for the city hall space needs, which shows 50 grand. So there's $275,000 right there that was just carried forward, but was not.
Right.
Thank you.
So then on page 260 is the local option sales tax fund. When we receive this money, we keep it in separate fund, and no other revenues are come into this, so we can keep it and track it separately. 60%, as you know, goes to the general fund as property tax relief, and the remaining 40% is available for community betterment. This is the funding that we use for CODA, asset, Ames Municipal Band, the Public Art Program, and then in addition to CIP projects, mostly in the Parks and Recreation Department.
So one time there's over $1 million excess, and we've drawn that down, and it's probably been the lowest I've seen as far the excess over 25%. But hopefully, we're going to start collecting on those internet sales, and we'll be able to boost that up. So what happened is you see when it says net change in fund, we didn't reduce our expenditures for capital improvements or to human service agencies. We kept giving them 5% increases, even though our revenues may have been flat or decreased. And we could do that because we had balances. But we're getting a little nervous, but now hopefully we'll turn the corner with additional revenue from the internet sales. We'll see. We'll follow it.
Have we heard anything more about when we might get something from the Airbnb hotel motel contribution?
Good point. I don't know. We'll have to check.
We heard about something at ACVB about that. I
You probably know
think
more.
that,
What that's-
I don't remember that we heard when it was going to happen, but
yeah, we had a date as to when the checks were expected to arrive from the state. I forget what it was.
I'll have to check my notes.
And then we're doing another round of $250,000 for the human service capital improvement.
You authorized that to work through United Way again with a little bit of administrative fee. Remember that?
So where is that?
Well, remember, some was out of local option, 200 was local option, and 50,000 was out of the general fund. So let's see, that would have been in, is that in the adjusted, the 200 this year?
I was looking, I thought it should be here too.
Let me think where it is.
Next year.
The other right was a 200 out of there. And
Yeah, it should be 200. Yeah, I'll see. Maybe the line's just not showing. I'll double
We'll have to
check.
find it.
I'll double check. Yeah, it was 50 in general fund and 200 in local option sales tax.
It maybe comes out of that unreserved balance. I don't remember if we did it after we did this or not.
We'll look and answer
We'll
that
check.
question.
Yeah.
Okay, on page 262 then is the hotel motel tax fund. Again, it's a special revenue fund. We keep it segregated from the other funds. The largest portion of this is passed through to the Ames Convention and Visitors Bureau. And then a portion is also transferred to general fund and to local option sales tax. And then on page 263
Excuse me,
is.
so some of this, remember we're talking about plazas and such? I think we're carrying forward $400,000 from general fund for a plaza, but you could see there was some money in available balance here we could add to if we had a project or two. You see the bottom line, ending balance? $1.2 million we're projecting. So there's extra money here we could
Right.
use for a one-time project. Not all of it, but some of it we could. You're in good position is what I'm saying.
Is there any targeted
There is not in this fund.
minimum fund balance target on?
There's not in this fund because there's no really obligation.
Most of it's just passed through, whatever we receive.
Whatever we get, we give to
passes through.
to Convention of Israel, and then 1% goes to economic development, 1% goes to replace the local option sales tax for us. So if the amount goes down, that's all we're obligated to give Convention of Israel Bureau. Fortunately, it hasn't in the past year. As you know, we're talking about perhaps one or two or three more hotels even. We're talking about at least one or two downtown, and I forgot there's some others out there. Road use tax?
Yep, and 263 is road use tax, which is funds almost all of our operations in public works for all of the different areas of the street maintenance, snow and ice control, a lot of the traffic operations, as well as funding a portion of the CIP projects as well.
Nowhere is the census more important, perhaps nowhere is it more important than road use tax, because that money is doled out on a per capita basis. There were times when cities, and I think we even did it once, did a special census, which is very costly, but it paid back like in 2 years, because if you increase your population, it will garner you millions of dollars from the state in terms of the road use tax. You pay this on your gasoline tax on your gas, when you pump gas, goes to the state, distributed back to the cities on a per capita basis. So we should have some good news, hopefully, when we do our census. And when is that? Next year?
Yes.
Are you aware, is there any mechanism for assessing road use tax to electrical vehicles in the long run? Is there any talk about that, or?
That's a good point. I don't know.
I hadn't heard anything.
No, it's not.
Right now, it's-
Not right now. There's a,
No. Thanks.
Yeah, good point. It could affect road use tax, obviously.
Okay, and then beginning on page 264, then we're going into some of the smaller special revenue funds that we have. The public safety special revenues is kind of a combination of several funds that we have that we track separately: police forfeiture, any of the grants that the police department receives. And this is the fund where we would have the donations that come for the animal shelter. And then we have miscellaneous donations also, which occasionally we have donations in either the police department or the fire department that would show here. Probably, I would say the largest portion of the balance in this area is for the animal shelter. They've built up a fairly good balance, I think, that they would are anticipating using for projects at the shelter. The next page,
Excuse me, was there
go
a
ahead.
study done on the animal shelter?
We're about to hire an engineer to look at that, to look at the
Okay.
possibility of refurbishing. If not, then we have a much larger project to look at. You'll see in the interim, we're still spending some funds for new kennels and other things, short-term, smaller projects, but we're going to hire a consultant to look at that.
on
You're missing something on 264 on this police grants and the police grants. Why is that up so much? On the manager's recommendation for 1920 budget.
yeah.
Does that have to do with the
That's
radio
supposed to be in the
state
animal
system?
shelter?
We'll have to check that out.
I don't know. Yeah, it does look like it's something.
Other money, is that the-
Check that out.
Yes, we'll double check it.
278,000. Seems high.
Well, compared,
Trying to think if we got a grant. I'm not sure. a Grant.
No, I think typically the police they just budget a level amount because they don't anticipate what their grants are going to be. But yeah, I'll double check what it was. I don't remember offhand either.
so it jumps off the page.
Well, it also shows revenues though at 278 also.
Yes.
yeah, it zeroes out.
Did they get some kind of a,
We'll check.
Yeah, I didn't do the fund sheets this year. I had someone else do them, so I'll double check it and see.
I remember signing some papers for, they did get some kind of grant or apply for some kind of a special grant,
Seems pretty
but I don't think,
large, though.
I don't
Yeah.
think it was that much.
And
but the point
if it
is-
was something current, I would think it would be in the adjusted year
Yeah,
instead.
okay.
But yeah, I'll double check and see what it is. Then on page 265 is the citywide housing program. This is funding that we have remaining from when we had the countywide housing program. We use this largely for, special projects that Vanessa's doing and to be the local contribution to some of the CDBG projects. A portion of her salary is charged here. And then on the following two pages, we have the Community Development Block Grant Program, which Vanessa will go over in more detail next week at her presentation. And then on 267 is a new fund for the home program. Anybody have any questions about any of those?
On 265, where's the revenue come for the citywide?
There's not revenue unless we have some, she has a few loans that we did, like for down payment assistance and things like that, that we sometimes get reimbursements on if someone like sells their home within a certain time frame. But otherwise, the fund balance is money that was left over from when we had the countywide program previously.
I see.
On page 268, the employee benefit property tax, that's one of the ones that Dwayne was explaining. This is where we levy for the police and fire retirement contributions. So we levy the taxes and then we transfer the money to the general fund to pay for those benefits. So this fund is just a zero balance every year.
You skip this.
No, I just did it quick.
You know,
And then 269 is the police and fire pension. Dwayne talked about this one earlier too. This is the funds that are remaining from when we had a city system versus the statewide system, and we're spending down the balance to help level our contribution rate to the state system. On page 270, Parks and Recreation donations and grants. A lot of the funding coming into these are the smaller grants. This does not include like the Winokur donation, which we're holding in a different fund. A lot of these are contributions for park benches or trees in parks. And there's also a small contributions in this fund for the block party trailer as well. And 271 is the Friends Foundation for the library. This is what the Friends Foundation money that they contribute to programming at the library. And then on page 272 is all of the other library donations and grants. Again, they get a lot of donations for book purchases and kind of smaller miscellaneous items that they keep there. And then on page 273 is actually a new fund we created for them this past year for library future needs. What they did there was they had funding left over in their donations and grants from the renovation project that people had committed to the building project, and when it came in under budget, they still had some funding left over, so they've set it aside in library future needs to start kind of a seed area for their next project that they might want to do down the road.
So how, on the Parks and Recs, Library Friends, so the pages 270, 271, 272, 273, are those all budgeted and expenses determined by the respective boards? Like the Park and Rec board set their budget
Right.
and
The Parks and Rec donations and grants are a lot of those are donations that they receive specifically, like they're smaller items, like to
targeted, so to
plant a
speak,
tree or do a bench. I'm not sure if they take those to the Parks and Rec board to be approved or not,
Well,
but
they don't approve it. The budget, they have no budgetary authority, you do. So they would follow the same procedures to you. If they're smaller, planting trees or benches, we would do it ourselves.
same for library then too?
Well, the library is under a different kind of a governing structure. They don't have to follow our purchasing policies or whatever, but are you asking, can they?
I'm just curious, I'm just more curious, not trying to micromanage, just more curious how it works in terms of what, like the transit board, they set their, budget and look at different things. I think it comes to us and we approve it, but they do a lot of the work on the, behind the scenes.
Yeah, Parks and Rec doesn't get involved in the financing.
Okay,
of
and so
it.
then how about library board?
Yeah, I'm not sure how they operate together.
I'm just, it's just more curious. We can move on.
yeah. I think for the Friends Foundation, they do work with the Friends Foundation for kind of what projects they would like to do, and then the board agrees to which projects they want to do.
Well, I'm sure they take it to the board for the big issues. We talk about
Right.
smaller items. I'm not sure, just like smaller items wouldn't come to you.
Yeah, I think they have more flexibility, like just with the donations and grants. And I do believe that they said that when they set up the Library Future Needs Fund, that would take a library board action to spend any of that funding. And on page 274 274 and 275 are several smaller funds. The utility assistance is the funding that comes in for project share and through the utility system. The miscellaneous donations still some funding we have left over from when we sold bike licenses that we will use for we've used it occasionally like for map printing or signage on the trails. We did have a little bit of public art donation money left there, but I believe that it was spent down this last year. Developer projects are funding we've received from developers that's committed to specific projects in the future. You can see we actually had a little bit of expenditure in 17-18 as the Oakwood Road trail was completed.
Remember, we talked about this recently with requests from Kurt Friedrich. This is where the money would have been placed.
Mm.
And now that'll probably be returned to them, and then they'll take on the obligation now. Where before, if they would have contributed, they would have been out of the obligation.
So it's currently in here.
I believe it's still in here because you didn't take the action until, was that the last meeting we did?
Yeah.
I think the budget was probably in place.
Some-
I don't think you
Right.
did that
Some
yet.
$80,000 or
And then the last one on this page is the Economic Development Fund.
So many times we match this with AEDC. We're going to be coming with a big one coming up on the 12th, a nice new project that we're going to draw some of this down.
Then on page 276 is the tax increment financing or the TIF fund. This is made up of several TIFs that we have, Kingland, ISU Research Park. And typically what we do is we issue the bonds, we start paying the debt service on the bonds, and then we begin collecting the property taxes as the projects are coming onto the tax rolls, as Dwayne explained earlier. So this is typical that it would be showing a negative balance because we would have been paying the debt on the debt service already. And then as the tax collections come in, eventually that fund will level off.
Yeah, so the key here is how quickly it's going to be a deficit. It's how quickly you pay it off. If we can say have something paid off in 8 years, that's very successful. Anything older than 10 is more difficult. And again, many people come in and they want you to issue for 20 years and things like that. You have to be careful. You might want to do it on certain circumstances, but we've been pretty successful at pretty quickly pay these back. I think the only one that's kind of lagging is our Bell Avenue one,
And that should be turning the corner a bit this year.
but it's
Yeah.
lagged. I don't know how many years it's
It's-
been going.
It's going to exceed the 10.
Yeah, it'll exceed the 10. And then we're working at the downtown projects. I think there's going to be requests for longer TIF, so we'll see about that.
And then on page 277 is the Special Assessment Fund that works in a similar manner to the TIF fund. We issue bonds for a project that's going to be assessed. We start paying the debt service on it, and then we collect through the assessment process. So that's also typical that it would have a negative balance and then level out as we collect the assessments over time. Then page 378 is the Street Construction Fund. This is where we show all of the outside funding for street projects, for shared use path projects, traffic projects.
Oh, I'm sorry, this
So
Friedrich's.
we show the expense here and then we show the funding covering those expenses. And then on page 279 is the Airport Construction Fund, which is for the larger airport, the CIP projects. We do a transfer from general fund to the Airport Construction Fund every year based on the profit that we make from the airport farm.
Let's don't call it profit, okay?
Oh, don't call it profit. Okay, so our net revenues.
Yeah, net revenue.
Net revenue.
We don't make profit, we use profit.
And we use it for,
The mayor calls that profit. I call it revenue over expenditure.
and we use it as our local match for grant funding that we have from FAA or other sources for airport projects. And on page 280 is the Park Development Fund. This is the fund where we do use it for CIP projects. We transfer $100,000 from local option sales tax to this fund to use for new park projects. This is also where we are holding the Winokur donation money here in this fund, which is why you see the large balance.
So how much, is that like almost $2 million?
It's about 1.8 something for the Winokur. So our $2 million, we'd have to take another 200,000 out of this fund too. The Park Development Fund, that's money you set aside each year for opportunities to respond quickly to develop new park opportunities. We haven't used it to renovate anything, mostly new parks, new facilities, things like that. So that's where it would come out of. When I say the balance, it's a combination. I think it's 1.8,
1852, 140.
1852, and the rest is the Park Development Fund. So when you have two new parks, we're going to start developing. Remember, we were going to do the one by, let's go Edward School. Remember, first time, we're going to use 80,000 for that. There's one across the street on Suncrest, I think is that a new park up there? Is it Suncrest or? I forgot. We're going to use that for new development. That's another
Sunset.
Park Development Fund.
Sunset.
Yeah, Sunset Ridge.
Sunset Ridge, excuse me, you're right. And we usually move, we try to move $100,000 a year from local option tax into this fund. That's where we finance the Park Development Fund from. Community betterment.
And on page 281 is the bond proceeds fund. This is where we bring in the revenue when we issue bonds for CIP projects. So the CIP expense total that is on here would be the projects that came directly out of the this year's capital improvement plan. The one difference is that we did change the radio replacement project, and what's reflected in the budget that you'll be adopting is the new higher amount that we did not have in the CIP. We passed out that additional page instead, but we do have that built in to this page.
So where's that at? Is that on our
It'd be the police services number, the 1520. And that would include the
gotcha,
amount that's
gotcha.
abated as well. Then on page 282, we have two permanent, we call them permanent funds or trust funds. One is for the perpetual care at the cemetery. And a portion of the cemetery lot sales goes here, and we hold it in perpetuity for if the library would cease, or the cemetery would cease operation, this would be, money would be held in trust to maintain the cemetery.
State law requires us to.
Yep.
Could you go back just a second? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Steve, when Chuck comes, do we also have Doug come and kind of explain that's the Storycom or Storecom, that new 28E agreement? That basically includes Story County, includes Iowa State, includes the City of Ames. I think it's good for council to hear just how that's, working, and that we're actually funding the backbone.
Okay, we brought that to the council, that actual agreement to the city council.
Okay.
They already approved it. Do you remember that?
Yep. Yeah.
You want to,
Just long we're all on the same page.
Okay.
Is that included in the 1.5 and the 1 million?
is what included?
We're paying for radios ourselves
And the backbone.
and the backbone.
The backbone's included in there.
Okay, all right, then it's
Yep.
not necessary.
Yep.
I thought it was something that,
But you can ask a question. They'll be prepared to talk. Doug will be.
I just know because I think Doug's been our representative, done a
Yep.
tremendous job. And
He
this
is. We
this
hope
comes
we
out of
get-
the EMS meetings we have quarterly and what's going on. I think they're really working
You
to,
might want to ask for an update, how we're doing in negotiations, We can explain the partnership and also where we're at on negotiations.
I
Might
think
have more information
it's
by
a
then.
great collaboration. And I think that there's some cool things that we're doing to try
Yep.
and make sure that we're ready and having extra radios and the backbone. But the point is that it's another example of great collaboration as a region to try and work together. And Ames is stepping up to the plate and being part of that. So it'd be just good to be.
We should get an update on where we're on negotiations too.
I was still shocked when I found out that each handheld radio costs between $5,000 and $6,000. So it's a little, you don't go to Lowe's and buy them. They're high.
You don't want to drop them.
You don't want to drop them. That's right. Anyway, sorry. Thank you.
And then on page 260 or 282, sorry, the other permanent fund that we have is the Furman Aquatic Center Trust Fund. This is a donation that we hold in perpetuity, but we can use the interest off of it. And you'll see this year for the first time in the adjusted and in the manager recommended budget, we are using some of that interest funding to pay for some smaller improvements at the aquatic center. I believe they're buying like deck chairs and new lane lines and things like that using this funding.
Does scholarships come out of this?
No, this would just be for improvement, I believe more physical improvements at the aquatic center. And on page 283, then we start the enterprise funds, which are the funds that we operate on a more business type of accounting. So the first one is the water utility fund on page 283, which shows the revenue coming in from all of the utility billings and other sources, and then it goes through the expenses, which includes both water and the water operation and treatment program, and then also the public works portion of the water utility. Does anybody have any questions so far? Then 285 is the water construction fund. This is separated out. It's the funding that we receive from the SRF, the revolving loan program, to pay for typically larger CIP projects. So as you know, this paid for the new water treatment plant, and we're also using some of that funding for the old water plant demolition. And then on the next page, on 286, is the water sinking fund, which is where we're paying the debt service for the state revolving fund loan payments. And then the sewer utility fund begins on 287. Again, we break out all the different revenues and expenditures involved there. And then on 289, the same thing, we have a separate fund for the SRF projects. And in this case, it's for both water pollution control and for the sanitary sewer system projects. And then on page 290, we also have a sinking fund to pay for the SRF debt that's being paid for out of the sewer utility. 291 is the electric utility, which goes on to 292. And then on 293, their sinking fund for paying their debt service.
Excuse me, here's why you have to be careful, because you look at the 292 and so there's $16 million excess, but you have to look at our 5-year capital plan, because we have a planned drawdown of that. So you want to say, oh, I want to take this money and use it for something else. You've got to look at our whole financial picture, which we do over 5 years. And that's why we could keep the rates the same, which is we had 4% increase. We're not projecting anything else, but we're consciously going to draw that money down. So that's, I think, good financial planning on our part, but we don't want you to jump at it and say, let's use it for something else.
And on 294 is the parking operations fund. And this does include the updates from just that we made the decision last week. So it does have reducing the downtown meter fee to 50 cents. And then we did reduce the number of CSOs that are paid from 15 to 13. And then on page 295 is the parking capital reserve, which is the new fund we set up last year for transferring the funding to hold for capital improvement projects.
Although in this one, you can see we're right at our operating balance that we wanted. So we're right there. There's no excess. So we're going to have to watch this fund. Remember, we'll come back with you after many months of the operation of 50 cents and see where we're at. There's some suggestion by Lori, we're actually going to gain more revenue. We'll see if that's true. But again, I'll tell you, as long as you keep, if we're going to keep waiving revenue, which is good, waiving revenue for events downtown or campus town. But also we become more effective in changing people's behavior, which is the intent of enforcement. Therefore, fine revenue is going to go down. As our expenditures go up, we're going to have an increase in revenue to balance this operation.
Do the game day fines go into effect 2019 fall?
Mm-hmm.
But is that reflected in any estimates for revenues?
To remember, on our analysis, we're projecting no net increase from it. We believe that the first couple of games, we're going to garner a lot of money
Uh-huh.
for the Iowa game and everything, but the word will get out
Yeah.
So we believe the last couple of games, you'll have less fines. Chuck calculated like a 50% drop off in fines. Even with the increase in the cost per fine, he's saying it could be flat.
Okay.
It will get their attention. You want to change behavior. You want to keep people out of those neighborhoods parking on both sides, but you will not, I don't think, have a windfall in revenue.
Sure.
Maybe I'll be wrong, but that's what we're conservatively projecting.
Okay, thanks.
So that's why you don't see a big increase in revenue. on
Or
this.
any increase. Yeah, okay.
We'll see.
Page 296 then is the Transit Operating Fund, which if you look at the revenues, you can see the fundings of the ISU student fees and administration both went up also 4.6%, in addition to the general fund transfer, which is the transit levy, which is the city portion of the transit operating budget. And then 297 is their Transit Student Government Trust, which they will occasionally use funding from that to pay for additional services that the students want that they didn't have anything budgeted for the current year. And then on page 298 is the Transit Capital Reserve, which is where they have their grant funding come in for purchasing vehicles and for building improvements, for bus shelter improvements, and some equipment purchases that they either use local funding for or that they sometimes have grant funding for. And 299 is the stormwater utility. And 300 is stormwater improvements. This is where we show the grant funding that are related to the stormwater improvement projects. And 301 is the operating fund for the Ames ISU Ice Arena. And on 302 is the Ice Arena Capital Reserve. This is where we make a contribution from the local option sales tax fund for the city portion, which is also matched by Iowa State. And this will pay for the capital improvements at the ice arena. And then 303 is the Homewood Golf Course Fund. And 304 and 305, resource recovery, which, as we've mentioned, is one of the funds we're watching closely. And there's different changes, being looked at for RDF fuel and possibly increasing fees again in the future.
The per capita perhaps will be not next year, but perhaps in the future we'll need another increase in our per capita charge.
So the unreserved fund balance at $66,000 strikes me as a low number, given the overall expenditures in this area. Is that something we should think about or no?
Well, by its very definition, unreserved means it's above your minimum balance, so that's considered gravy. I think what you're really questioning, whether our minimum reserve should be only 10%. That's where the real issue is.
Right.
Ideally, you don't need anything more than whatever your minimum balance is. So we'll have to look at it and see if that's enough. I think you're really asking, should it be a higher number than 10%?
Yep, you're right. That is a better way of saying it.
Yeah.
Maybe this year, it just seems like we've had a number of cost overruns on things where change orders that were big ticket items. So I don't know what that number should be.
Yeah, well, mostly it's affected by the downtime at the electric utility. When the electric utility is down for those boiler tubes, what happens is it's very inconvenient and costly for our haulers who have to haul it. But for us, we don't get any revenue from materials coming in because it's closed. And then some of the material we have to reject, we take out and we haul because we can't process to the Boone landfill. So it's kind of a double whammy. We lose revenue, expenditures go up. That's why it's very important that we fix the tubes, which are all in the budget you've seen, to keep the plant, at least the electric plant, open. Then we have to do what we need to do on the resource recovery side to make sure it's running. We make the investment in the facility itself so it doesn't have a lot of downtime. So we try to, ideally, we would have a couple of weeks of scheduled downtime for annual repairs, but we want to make sure both plants are operating. That's why we have a new formula that's been discussed between the two departments. It's kind of an incentive formula on if one of them, let's say the resource recovery plant has the material ready to go, the plant's processing, and the power plant's down, they will still pay as if they were accepting it because it was something that they did that caused it, and vice versa. If the power plant's open and the resource recovery can't deliver, then there'll be less revenue coming to the power plant. We had to change the formula that's been historically tied to the BTU value of coal. That's how the price was set for the sale of RDF to electric. That obviously changed with gas. So there is a new formula that takes in therms, the gas equivalent, but also this downtime kind of incentive or disincentive either way. So
It seems like the determination on the percentage for minimum fund should be based upon the fluctuations in that account. So if there were no fluctuations, you could really have zero. But in this case, when you look at some other areas like the ice arena, it has a 15%. So this isn't something we can work on today
No,
necessarily, but maybe for Dwayne and Nancy, taking a look
Sure.
at that, it's really more of an accounting issue in terms of whether the fluctuations warrant a higher a minimum fund balance.
well, more than that, we need to stabilize the revenue. You know, that's the key.
That's been our focus, to reduce the
Either side.
fluctuations.
Either
Reduce
side of
the
the equation.
fluctuation.
Right.
So we don't have to. But it is an interesting dilemma as our citizens respond in many ways, and one of them is in terms of producing less waste, which is good, is it not, per capita? Less waste goes in the plant, therefore you have less revenue. So the more we do educate people, that's great, and then we have that challenge. So we think we're going to make that up as the city grows, right? The per capita amount going into the process will go down, but we won't have to make major capital expenditures to expand our plant because the capacity will be there as each individual reduces. But we have to watch all that.
So is that something you would do on your own, or do you need council action to
No, we
ask
do
you
We
to look at that fund balance
John thinks
percentage?
about it every day, John Joyner and Bill. We're looking at it all the time.
So you would come back and let us know if you thought the percentage needed to be higher?
Yeah, well, yes, but like we're saying, it's not just percentage, it's the whole operation, fluctuation.
No, I
price.
agree. I said it incorrectly. It's not obviously looking at just expenses. You look at revenues.
We're looking at the financial viability of this operation all the time and what it takes to do that.
Okay.
A minimum balance is just one of them. We hope we never have to use the balance, that we have a stable stream of revenue and a consistent expenditure flow that will take care of these variations.
Okay,
But
thank you.
balance is one of them, so that's a good point. Thank you.
So Mary Rankin and Bill were here and gave us that report. And they had some, like, potentially going to composting, and they had some other plant improvements. Would that fall underneath the CIP number for resource recovery, or where, if they were going to do a composting facility?
Well, they're not going to do a composting facility, remember, but they may,
I mean,
we might incentivize someone working with the private sector that may come out of an operational cost.
okay.
I don't think they were suggesting a community-wide composting facility just yet.
Okay.
But working with private sector, there may be some type of expenditure to them to incentivize them. But there's an example, we're keeping that waste out. Again,
Mhm.
that helps us.
Right.
We want to drop that because there's an example of that goes into the waste stream, not processed, and then we have to deliver it to Boone landfill. There's your cost of exporting. It's very expensive to do that. So we could cut that cost. That helps the bottom line. Two things. The transportation of rejects are not good for us. So we want to reduce the amount of rejects. And a lot of that could be the heavies from the waste material.
So that's reject disposal underneath expenses, under operations. So you're budgeting $1.36 million to send stuff to the landfill.
There you go.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
I just want to put this in perspective. That's maybe if we were taking a landfill and we didn't have the resource recovery plant, that transportation cost would be many, many times that. Because remember, 100% comes in. Sometimes we only have 30% go out. We recycle metals, we burn RDF.
Mhm.
So imagine if that represents 30% of the transportation cost. Imagine if we had a landfill, we had to do 100% of it. So it's still good. Even sustainability, the amount of trucks that would be driving to a landfill someplace, it would be maybe 3 times that cost.
This goes
But
to
it-
Bronwyn's point that we talk about resource recovery, but we're not recovering that. That's going into the landfill. So of the $4.7 million, 1.36 is hauling over to landfill. This was your point. I thought it was a good point.
But it's volume reduction. Remember, we're not landfilling 100% of materials.
Right.
Just
It's a good thing.
The
Yeah.
point of the resource recovery plant is reducing landfilling.
Volume reduction into landfill.
Yeah, not.
And there is some recycling with
Yeah.
metals,
Yeah.
glass,
And a little energy.
and then we get some energy out of it.
Yeah.
Which could save us a little bit, or it doesn't cost us more because we try to price it like the gas would cost, right? So it's still relevant, I believe. You just have to, the terminology is what you want us to be careful about using.
And how much of that reject disposal, is that stuff that like the Rummage Rampage in theory is trying to get out of the waste stream too, right? So
You have to be big metals they pull out and
furniture.
mattresses,
and-
furniture, but also just the heavies that fall out of the process itself.
I see.
Yeah, everything that can't be recycled that's not light enough to burn, right? That's not.
From the classifiers, air classifiers blow it up, so it's. So we'll keep looking at, this is one, it's going to take constant surveillance for a number of reasons, because it's not just controlled by us, it's our, it's our customers' lifestyles, how it affects us too, right? And again, if we're doing our job, we're going to have less and less materials coming in, which means reduced revenue.
So that was the last of the business type funds. Does anybody have any questions about any of the utilities or the other smaller ones? Then on 306 is the debt service fund, which Dwayne talked about earlier. This is where the property taxes are brought in to cover our principal and interest payments on our GO debt. And you can also see the transfers that come in from the different TIF districts and from special assessments and some of the utilities for abated debt as well to help pay for that.
I'm not sure where the right place to ask this is, but I'll try it here.
Okay.
So when we have like a major improvement, like the library project or the waterworks, right? We'll sell some bonds, and then at that point we have an idea of how many years it's going to take to pay off that bond.
Right.
But when in any individual year's budget, we only see like a year of debt service. That year's debt service being
Right.
applied to this project. So I guess you could go back to the original issue and figure out how far along you are in paying off the anticipated debt service
Yeah.
for this project.
Yeah.
Is it represented anywhere else in the budget? We can see like library has 5 more years. or
No,
something like
not in the budget, but I mean, anytime you'd want any of that.
We
It
have
gets
it.
a little bit more complicated because in recent years with the lower interest rates, we've refunded so many times. So,
Yeah.
So for example, if you ask me, where we are with, we issued some 20-year bonds for the Ada Hayden Heritage Park. I think that one's been refunded twice. Now I can go back and pull out the section of that so that it gets a little bit messier, but for the most part, we could tell you exactly where we are, where we are to getting the library paid off, where we are, Fire Station 3, I believe, is paid off now. Any of those things.
We get all.
If you're curious or if you'd like a schedule, we could get
Thanks.
any
Yeah,
of
it
those.
is just a matter of curiosity.
Yeah, I mean,
But-
I'm
'cause I know
always kinda
it's
curious
all being
about that
accounted
too,
for.
where
It's
are
being-
we?
Yeah.
When we had City Hall paid off, we did a little ceremony down in the
Well,
lobby.
we know
so,
too, because we
yeah.
prescribe it. It's not a guess. We
Yeah.
issue for 12 years. That's
Yeah.
when it has to be paid off.
Right. Right. But you can refinance too, right?
If you refinance, yeah, unless you don't refinance. But even if you refinance, then you still have a debt
We still
schedule.
do, but then it's mixed in with
It's a debt
other things.
Thanks. I get it.
Beginning on page 307, we have several internal service funds. These are funds where other departments in the city contribute, and then we offer a service to our own departments. So the first one on page 307 is Fleet Services. This is their operating fund. So this would be paying for all of the operations at the Fleet Services facility and the motor pool for them maintaining the vehicles. And then on page 308 is the Fleet Service Reserve Fund. This is where we have departments contribute to this fund. It's like a savings account for them so they can accumulate over time the funding to replace the large pieces of equipment and vehicles in the city.
This is a great thing we do, put away money on an annual basis for replacement, so we don't have any blips in our budgets. Now, we do this for everything except for SIRIDE vehicles and fire department apparatus, not the fire chief's car and those kind of cars, but the big, those vehicles that are over $1 million, it will be difficult to even make the annual payment on that. It would really hit their budgets, operating budgets. So other than the fire apparatus, and you saw in our CIP, the ladder truck's $1.7 million. And even a pumper was, $800,000 or $900,000. And our new SIRIDE buses are up close to $1 million. So it'd be tough to incur the cost on an annual basis to put away for it. But other than that, you see all of our tractors, our vehicles, our trucks, we've tried to put away for this. And the amount we put away varies. A car, how we depreciate it over a number of years versus a 2-ton truck. So it'll all vary. And those numbers are updated each year by Corey to make sure at the end of whatever that time frame is, we now have the replacement amount available. Not what we paid for it, because the cost has probably gone up. So it has to be adjusted. And that's factored into those operating budgets. But it's really good because you don't have those fluctuations again. When all of a sudden we have to buy these big 2-ton trucks and you're going along, and then the budget one year has to go up and go down again. So very good. And it takes a lot of discipline again for the council to support this in tough times. See those fleet reserve monies, there's money in there. People would say, let's draw that money down and use it for something else. Would not be wise. So
So
we thank you.
why is there $10 million in the ending balance for that? And are you anticipating, you're showing that we're spending about a fleet acquisition, $1 million, but it's kind of starting to go up a little bit. I was just curious, is there a reason why we're trying to have this big cash amount in the ending balance for fleet service or reserve?
No, I
This
think-
represents the amount of money we have.
Right.
We have put away in the bank
Uh-huh.
to purchase things. It's not
Like the ladder truck.
Right,
not the ladder.
not the ladder
truck.
truck.
Not the ladder
Or
truck.
SIRIDE.
But if we're only spending, I'm just,
Right, well, I think
your
Corey,
expenses, your fleet acquisition, you're recommending budgeting $1 million to buy stuff, right?
I think Corey, what Corey does is he projects out the life of each vehicle individually. So there might not be a lot in this year, but there might be higher
Okay.
in other upcoming years. So it's done by piece of equipment. So if we would have one year, we maybe have, several pieces of equipment that are over 500,000
Okay.
each. So
Yeah,
balance will go
there's
up
no
and down.
strategy financially in this one. This has to do with he determines the the condition of the vehicle, and if it needs to be replaced, we replace it because we have the money. So it's not like we're trying to balance this out 10 million a year or 9 million a year. And remember, over the years, I imagine those same vehicles cost more. So that same vehicle, you're going to spend 10 million, what you paid $8 million before. But that's the balance of the savings account for all the vehicles that haven't been purchased yet.
And so in the meantime, these fund balances are held in funds that match inflation? Or are they just cash, or what's?
We consolidate all our investments. So, that's how we handle both our investment and cash flow. So it'll make whatever we make on our total combined.
Sure, but
investment
is it fair to think of that as being something that kind of matches inflation, or?
Yeah, it really
something,
depends, but
not-
yeah, I think that would be, reasonable.
Not vehicle inflation, if that's what you're talking about.
No, I'm talking
No,
about
but the-
just,
Yeah, very rarely can we rely on interest to help soften the blow on the purchase price.
I don't mean that.
It just doesn't, truck inflation and purchase trucks go up a lot greater than we can invest our money in.
Sure.
So we have to budget for that increase.
then on page 309 is the Information Technology Fund. This is the operating fund for our IT department. So this would pay for all of the data services, also the phone system, all the network charges. As you can see, we balance it to break even. Whatever their expenditures are going to be, we allocate to all of the departments so that it breaks even at the end of each year. And then similarly to fleet on page 310, they also have a reserve fund. Departments, similarly to fleet, they pay an amount each year in and have those funds available for when they need to replace PCs, laptops, printers, any of their technology needs.
Sure. Nancy mentioned the reserves here for information technology, and we don't really have anything designated for the 147.
No,
And we've had some discussion about doing a study on security. And we're still working on, kind of nailing down what that would be, but we've looked at some other ones and we're estimating around 25,000 for that. So that's something we could do, or council could decide to do at budget time or later, and we could take that out of that funds that we hold right now. We didn't have a good idea of what it might cost, but it's certainly at that level that we could absorb that.
Take it out of balance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because it never changes anyway, right?
right,
What?
The balance doesn't change.
right, no,
Yeah.
No.
What do you mean never change?
We
It doesn't
We
change.
balance it out. every-
yeah.
It'll change if we spend 25,000. Yeah.
Then on 311 is the shared communication system. This is the communication system that we share with Iowa State, Story County, and the E911 system. So we have expenses here, and then they're allocated out to the different agencies. And so it's billed through our IT department. And so that's another fund that breaks even between the revenues and the expenses. And then the last two on page 312 and 313 are our risk insurance fund and our health insurance fund. And the risk insurance fund is on 312. This includes the property insurance. You can see the different types of expenditures listed there, the transit insurance, professional liability insurance, and it also includes risk administration and internal safety training that we do. And then also the workers' compensation program is included in this fund.
I mean, look at that. That's pretty good. We have an in-house risk manager who does a great job. Look at some of the costs of these. And we've had some claims, as you know. There's a lot of money floating around there, and he does a great job of managing this.
And then on 313 is the health insurance fund. And as we mentioned earlier, that we're the health insurance increase that we're projecting on rates that we're charging to the departments for 1920 is only 2%. With that, we still feel like the fund balance is in a good position and will be adequate to cover if we would happen to have claims that would come in a little bit higher than anticipated.
And these are two funds that have fluctuated over the years. The risk management's in good condition right now, but, from time to time we'll get, it seems like the comp claims especially kind of come in bunches, and, we can see that go up and down. So it's nice to have it up right now, but I think we can't expect that to be there forever.
And that's all the funds. If anybody has any questions.
So on that, I'm just trying to catch major deviations. So the net change in fund is a minus 400%.
In,
The change, this one right here.
So
yeah, that's a little misleading because we went from a slight negative change in the fund balance. I mean, we're attempting more or less to break even. So it was a little bit negative, and now we're looking at a change that's a little bit positive. It's not a huge amount of money
It's not a negative.
in relationship to the size of the fund. That's one where, percentage might be a little bit misleading, especially when we go from a negative to a
Okay.
positive number.
I see. That's
Actually,
all.
it says negative, it's positive, isn't it?
It was negative in the adopted. When
In
we
the
adopted
adopted,
last year, we
yeah.
thought we might eat into the fund
I'm
balance
saying this is a
little
good
bit.
thing. We now
Yeah,
have
it
100.
is.
We're going for a negative dipping 33,000 to actually a positive 100,000
Plus though.
or 510,000 that year. That's a good thing.
That's really shit. So it's really a growth. It's not a decrease.
That's what I'm saying. It's really
Yeah.
not negative, is it?
Yeah, that should
Well,
be,
math.
Should be a
no.
positive.
yeah, from a negative.
But if you multiply a negative and a positive, you get a negative.
We should change that though. make it
Yeah.
absolute
Positive.
change. Yeah,
That's a good thing.
yeah.
But we're still relatively small, a group, and it's possible, and I hope it doesn't happen, but we could have 3 open heart surgeries or a birth of premature baby. I mean, some of these run up a lot of costs, even though we have stop losses on it. So that's why you need balances. It can fluctuate by $500,000 to $1 million. But we've got to give credit to our employees who I think understand and work with on us. I think we have a very attractive healthcare plan compared to other cities. We're probably ahead of other cities. But I think our employees realize that and they help us to monitor themselves and their cost control. And they're partners on us in this, and they help keep the cost down as much as possible. So we have to thank them for that. I think they appreciate what you do for them because you're the ones who provide this benefit. Oh, yeah, my letter's there. I am sure you'll enjoy reading that. I always enjoy writing it. And checking with other cities, most of them are 1 or 2 pages. I like to take 11 or 12 pages. So you'll enjoy reading that. These documents will be on the internet.
It is out there now, posted.
I'll post it now. Everybody will see that.
I didn't see the special reports set up there.
No,
We could.
we can,
Yeah.
yes.
I'd love that. Do you?
Get the
Yeah,
special
it's
reports
PDF.
out.
Sure.
We'll
I
get
think
it
so.
out.
I find it really helpful to look at this.
Good.
Sure.
We can do that.
So if there are no more questions, we'll get ready for next Tuesday night, right? Our first hearing. We're going to talk about program and activities. The different department heads will be here starting Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night at 5:15.
Does the calendar show which presentations are going to be made in each hearing?
Diane has that
I
schedule.
believe that's on the agenda. I'm not sure if it's on the calendar or not, but she has an agenda for each of the,
Yeah, we have a
You mean on the
schedule.
website?
Right. So somebody
Amy,
was
is-
gonna-
Oh, I don't know.
we can put that on there.
It would, it'd be helpful if someone had an interest in a particular area,
Yeah.
you know?
Definitely.
To know which night to come.
Yep, thank you for doing that.
Amy, you want to take care of that for us? And make sure Diana. Thank you. Yeah, that'd be helpful for people. Any questions, any more information you want on the big scale of the budget here?
So Dwayne and Nancy, you get 11 months off then now after this, is that right? Or-
I don't know, because it takes more than a month to do this.
I'd be happy with a weekend.
I thought you said it only took you a couple of weeks to do this, is that right?
Nancy's bad if she can go get a cup of coffee.
And Nancy spent many hours in the week, after hours and weekdays and weekends, so I want to
So-
thank her for that.
Maybe remind us, so the department chairs start this process, is it September, October?
Actually, they're called the early eights. They start in August, don't they?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
really start kicking it off in
See, the budget
August.
builds on some of the internal departments like HR, fleet services. They have to
IT.
develop their budgets because then they are then layered into the operating department's
Right.
budgets. So we start the CIP and the operating budget back in August.
All right.
So we go all the way through till the end of January. We were literally working to the last couple of weeks when it moves up through a probe team, which is made up of 2 assistant city managers and Nancy and Dwayne. And then the departments sieve through the recommendations from their division heads. And it goes up through the probe team and it comes up to me for final decisions and another look. So it has 3 or 4 looks at it. So it's a pretty good process. Department heads use their division heads and below to get their recommendations. And then, we have to look at it and make prioritizations. They do, the group does, and then I finally make the recommendations. So it's a long process. It is. Very good process. I think you should be proud of the staff who works on it. And again, we're thankful for all you do because it takes a lot to remain conservative in your revenue estimates and your expenditures. You have some conservative philosophies here on balances, on debt service limits, all those type of things, which helps us to be rated very high, our credit rating, and looked upon as a very well-run city in terms of financial management. So we thank you for that support too.
So will we get some kind update in terms of what we're doing on 321 State Street? The next step?
Well, actually, that's going to be a whole agenda item. So I don't think you want to talk about the budget, but that's an agenda item. We've got to come back with our strategy, how we're going to do that.
And is there anything in the budget for that then, or not?
It's under the it's under the, well, you'll see it under the
CDBG.
Oh, yeah.
the CDBG. Is it on the fund balance or show?
It should show on the fund balance of the CDBG fund too, but
What page are you going to, Nancy?
Whether it's
I'm looking under Vanessa's,
Section.
the home balance was
yeah, if
shown
you look
there.
on page
Sure.
192, she's got 321 state
Adjusted.
in the adjusted budget,
What page?
192.
So she'll briefly mention it, but I think we need a whole item on the agenda to talk about it.
Yeah. Okay.
Good
Anything
question.
else? Any questions for staff? Well, as always, this is really amazing to go through all this. Thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you.
All right. Next, we'll take up disposition of communications. There are 3 items. Number 1's letter from Allison Brundy. Request to consider for discussion ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions during the January goal setting retreat. It seemed to me this is just more or less just something to take in consideration for tomorrow morning.
So is it fair to say this is something we were able just to make a decision about doing tomorrow or not? So we don't have to take any action now?
But generally, we're free to bring up various topics for discussion on changing the goals. So
Yeah.
bring up whatever we like.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Okay. Item 2, email from Joel Hochstein, request to add inclusionary zoning as a topic at future council meeting. And I'm sorry, you have to remind
We
me.
delayed it
Wasn't
from last
that
week because
delayed?
we didn't
Yeah.
have a specific enough
Yeah.
ask.
Okay. And then item 3 is a request to incorporate 100,000 for an AIM sign, I-35 into a CIP. Can you give us any kind of direction on our?
That's in our supplementary materials.
Yeah.
Again, that's not a CIP item. You'll have to decide how you're going to fund it
Fund.
out of operating.
So this will just take all 3 of these under consideration. There's no action necessary then. Okay. All right. Council comments, Gloria?
The International Town and Gown Association Conference is coming up in May from the 19th through the 22nd. I don't know if any of you have signed on to go to that conference. It's in State College, Pennsylvania. But the early bird fund rate for it ends February 15th. And so I thought it might be good to know that we could save the city a few $100. I am going to that conference because of my role as the University Communities Council Chair for National League of Cities, and they're picking up my registration fee. And as of yesterday, I am organizing a session that I hope is going to be accepted for the ITGA conference. Dan Culhane, Reg Stewart from Iowa State University, and Joel Hochstein and I are going to be talking about AIM's efforts to improve diversity and inclusion, and the way the 3 entities have partnered to try and improve the community conversation. So I'm optimistic that we'll be on the agenda, but it sounds like a good conference. That's it.
Thanks. David?
I'd like to just briefly revisit something I think we overlooked when we were doing the downtown parking discussion last week or last meeting. That was about the possibility of accepting credit cards and debit cards more routinely. And we just kind of skipped over that topic. So what I'd really like to do is make a motion that we explore that a little more thoroughly. But what do I have to do here? Do we have to put it on an agenda again in order to talk about this? Or can I just make a motion and see, then have you tell me that we have to put it on an agenda, or what should I do?
We gave you a report on that. Remember the cost of changing that over was very expensive?
Yeah, and that's not what, I'm not talking about visiting individual meters to do something.
You're not.
No.
So what are you talking about?
I'm talking about the ability to, for example, use credit cards and debit cards at City Hall to buy smart cards,
Oh.
or to pay for fines, or to pay for permits. And
Just
and that
there,
sort
you're
of thing.
talking
I
City
see
Hall?
John is approaching.
Yeah, I believe that was in the December memo from Damien, but he had been working with finance on that, and currently the customer service directly below us downstairs doesn't have that capability, but for instance, the community center does. So he was working with finance to see what it would take to get that capability brought into the customer service area so that someone could come in and use a debit card, credit card for what you're mentioning.
So we're going to
Okay.
report back when we find out.
Well,
There's a way to do it.
He's working with Craig Mickley on how to do that, I believe.
Well, so
Yeah, we were actually talking about other locations too,
Oh.
possibly
Yeah.
down the library.
So that's, it's in the
So-
works.
What I understand is we're looking at it, it can be done, so we're going to get your report back.
okay, that was unclear from the
Right.
memo. I thought the memo just sort of said, well, it would take some work and that's the end of the story, but it sounds like you're actually
Yeah,
still.
it's in the works, so we could send a memo back to you when that capability is up and running, let you
That's
know.
great. Okay, thanks. Then no motion necessary then. Thank you.
Anything else, David?
No.
Steve, remind me, did you want us to take some kind of action to bring a report on Emerald Ash Borer back on, you want us to do something? So it's been a while since we have had any kind of report on efforts.
Or do you want to wait and budget and ask Keith when you do that? Or do you want an in-depth report, or can he just give you a little bit of, he may be able to give you a little bit of briefing at the budget time, or do you want an in-depth report?
I would just like to know how we're doing in our efforts to remove trees and then plant new trees.
He might be able to just give you, if you wanted just a short answer, he could probably give it to you.
Or if John can do it now.
That started out in Public Works, and now with the urban forester, that's now in Parks and Rec.
Right.
But part of the original plan when we kicked it off was that at year 5, we would report back, which I think would be this fall. So this fall, Keith and the urban forester will work on a comprehensive report to bring back to you. That was part of the original plan, but if you wanted something earlier, that's certainly something you
I
could.
mean, just even a paragraph of just update. A lot of work has been done. We've seen city crews out.
He can probably brief you when he's here for the budget.
So I don't need a lengthy report, but if you could ask.
Okay,
him to
I'll
just-
be prepared to
Just
answer.
do a paragraph of summary of what we've done. That would be great.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's all I have.
Nothing today.
Alan?
nothing for me.
Nothing.
Just a couple of things. One is I forwarded to council. We have City of Ames, along with about 12, 13 other large communities, hires a lobbyist for down at the legislature. And so this is the first year last year Bob Kindred stood in for me and kind of has got on conference calls and stuff. And this year I'm getting up to speed on that. So we're getting weekly reports now. They give us kind of a snapshot. So I'm going to be forwarding. I sent that to you already as I get it. But if there's something that does come up or you see or you have some concerns, let me know. But they're very receptive to feedback from, communities. We've also been forwarding it to staff on some of these things. Unfortunately, fireworks has kind of reared its ugly head. And they're trying to basically dilute even further our control in terms of what we say you can and can't do in the community. But we've filed a position on that. I sent an email on that. But anyway, just FYI. And then the other thing is that we're all aware of it. But tomorrow we meet at 8:30 for our kind of a goal fine tuning, I would say it would be. And then also looking forward to having Donna there and kind of working through how we can be more efficient as a council as well too. So otherwise, entertain a motion
Move to
to
adjourn.
adjourn. All right. We are adjourned. Thank you.